Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie. I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the BMFA, and today it is my honor to introduce Celeste Fetta, the Joan P. Director of Education and the Assistant Deputy Director of Art and Education here at the BMFA. She is going to talk a little bit about our current exhibition, Benjamin Wigfall and Communications Village, and some of the pieces in our permanent collection that relate to this exhibit that we have going on now. So with that, I will pass it off to Celeste.
Thanks so much, Katie. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be with you here virtually for our 3 in 30. What we're going to look at today are 3 works of art that connect to Wigfall from our permanent collection. Before we get into that, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about Benjamin Wigfall. So these are 2 images of him from 1949 on the left, and on the right is from 1953. And this is really, we're focusing on about 7 years early on with his relationship with BMFA and right before he goes to Hampton University. So it's a really focused time frame that we're going to take a look at today. And the 3 works that we're going to look at, the first one is something he would have seen here at the museum. The second one he would have seen, but he also knows the person who created it, knew the person who created it. And then the third one has a connection with how one of his iconic works entered the collection. So that's kind of the framework we're going to be taking a look at today. So Benjamin Wigfall was born in 1930 in Richmond, and he grew up in Church Hill. So he is from the city, and we're very proud to call him one of our own from Richmond. Benjamin was really interested in art early on. He would sketch, he loved to listen to classical music, and he really was itching for art instruction. And at the time, in the segregated city, that in schools, Black schools, there were no art teachers, or very limited. So he did not have access to that. And he really championed to his Armstrong leadership, Armstrong High School, the need for an art teacher. So he pushed for that over the course of his time at Armstrong. And during that push, the state of Virginia was also, for the first time, professionalizing art education as a state initiative. And VMFA was really part of that process as part of the Virginia Art Alliance, and also advocated for the need of really a state art education program. And 2 women were very important, and really the reason why art education was really professionalized and brought under the state, the Department of Education. Sarah Joyner, you see her on the left, and Mary Godfrey on the right. So Sarah Joyner was the first art education supervisor for the entire state, and she was hired in 1948. And she very quickly realized the inequity between Black schools and white schools, and the lack of art education opportunities in Black schools. And she decided very quickly, one of the first things she did was create an assistant secretary, assistant supervisor position to focus on bringing teachers to Black schools, and hired Mary Godfrey, who's pictured on the right. And Mary Godfrey went right to work, and the number of teachers in art teachers in Black schools really skyrocketed because of Mary Godfrey. So keeping in mind, 1948 was senior year for Ben Wigfall, and he had been pushing. 1948, Joyner and Mary Godfrey are pushing. And so finally, for that 1948 fall into spring, teachers were hired for the city of Richmond. So on the left, the gentleman standing here, Stafford W. Evans, he was hired and for the 47 to 48. So they were, Mary and Sarah came on in 47. He was hired. He taught in an elementary school in the fall, and in the spring, he was the art teacher at Armstrong High School. So finally, the spring semester of Ben's senior year at Armstrong, he had an art teacher. And Stafford Evans is someone that he would continue to reference for the rest of his life, of having a profound influence on him personally, but also in his artistic practice. So he would also, Ben would also talk about Mary Godfrey's profound influence, because he met her because Stafford Evans, one of the first things he did with Ben is brought him to the MFA. So he brought him to the museum, which he had never been to before. Mary Godfrey, because of our connection, the museum's connection with Virginia Art Alliance and, Sarah Joyner, was at the MFA pretty frequently. We're not sure if she was teaching classes, but she was here while Ben was here. So he met Mary, and he was coming to the museum hopefully to take part in art classes that the museum offered. They were segregated classes for Black students, but he was too old. These were for like elementary school students. So Mary encouraged him to go through the galleries, visit the library. These took place on Saturdays when the museum was closed to the public. So he has stated then in these interviews that he would just have the galleries to himself. And he always felt there was no barriers for him during that time frame. And this really was the first opportunity for him to see art from across the country. It's where he saw a Feinegger, who was an artist who dealt in abstraction, and that had a big influence on his artistic practice. So you will see, if you read about Ben or read interviews about him, the names Stafford Evans and Mary Godfrey come up over and over again through the rest of his life. So it's just and again, I'm biased about educators and their impact, of course, but it's just a great story of how educators influenced Benjamin Wigfall, and he would go on to be a teacher at Hampton and later SUNY New Paltz, and mentor students, teens. So it's really this beautiful full circle story about the importance of education and the importance of teachers. So I mentioned he was coming to the museum in 1948, and this is a great photograph of what the galleries looked like in 1948. This is from our archives, about 1948 to 1951. These are the American galleries. And so this is what he would have seen and been going through. And I'm gonna use my cursor here, and this work right here, it's really in kind of pro silhouette here, because the lighting, of course, is not great in this photograph. But we're going to be looking at this piece as our first work. So I mentioned that the first work we're going to see is something he would have seen in the galleries, and it's this piece right here. This work is called Tired. So that also can help us convey or understand a little bit about what this person may be experiencing. They could perhaps be tired from a long day. Their eyes may be tired from reading, tired of having to read, as Helena suggested. And the work is by a woman named Samela Sanders Lewis, and she made this while she was in college. It was, like I mentioned, at the museum when Benjamin Wigfall would have been coming to the galleries, but it actually had come into the collection in 1944 as a long-term loan. And it was on view at the museum for the first time in 1944 at an exhibition of college student work. This was during the war, organized by an interim director, who was a woman at the time, who again was looking for a way to highlight the work that was going on at colleges. And Samela was a student at Hampton University. That's another great Wigfall connection, which is where he attended and then later taught. And she had the work there. There were several works by Hampton students during that show. And the RTD, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, actually said that the work by the Hampton students were really the best works in the exhibition, which was, pretty bold, pretty great statement to have, and a lot of accolades for those students. So from that exhibition, a professor at another university bought this work and then in turn loaned it to the museum for that long-term loan. And it stayed in the galleries through the 1950s, but so it's back on view in our American galleries now. And it's the first time I've ever seen it. And I've been at the museum for quite some time. So just really delighted to have that back up, and a great connection to Wigfall. Now on the right is a picture of Samela Lewis from 1947. She's standing, it looks like in a house maybe, and she is holding works that she has made. And there's a painting beside her to her left. There's a charcoal looking sketch at her feet. So she's sort of surrounded by works. And a lot of her works are figural, like this sculpture, but she worked in across mediums. She was a protege of Elizabeth Catlett, the famous printmaker, painter, and sculptor, who was teaching at Hampton at the time. And Samela Lewis, what an amazing person. She passed away just last year at the age of 99. And she would go on to be the first American woman to receive a PhD in art history. That was in 1951. She taught at several universities. She worked at museums. She founded the Museum of African American Art in LA. She founded the first journal dedicated to African American art that's still in publication today. She's known as the godmother of African American art. And we have one of her early works from when she was in college that we're really, really fortunate to own, or to have a long-term loan. So as I mentioned, this came into the collection as a loan in 1944. That same year, two other works by African-American artists also entered the collection through gifts, one by Leslie Bowling, which is a sculpture on view in the galleries today, and a work by Jacob Lawrence, Subway Home from Work, not currently on view, but still in the collection. So again, these would have been on view for Ben to see when he came to see the classes. Now, another work he would also have seen would have been this by artist George H. Ben Johnson. And this entered the collection in 1945, and it was the first work purchased by the museum by an African-American artist. And it was on view in the 10th annual Virginia Artists Exhibition that the museum started to host, I guess in the early 1940s, after it had been hosted at a different location by the Richmond Art Alliance. So it came to the exhibition series came to the museum, and this work was in that show. And from that show, the museum would always purchase works of art. So this won first place purchase prize that year in 1945. And again, we're going to take a look at this, and I'm going to describe it as well. So we're looking at a landscape of mountains. In the foreground, there's sort of a craggy brown and sort of cobalt blue rock formation. And then middle ground, we see mountains that are bluish, greenish. And then in the background, more mountains, but these are much more lighter in color. You see lavenders, light blues, and just a touch of orange on the peaks. And then right above these, about a quarter of the way from the top of the canvas, are clouds. So there's a lot of pastels here, but you know, the gradation of color goes from dark to light, kind of bottom to top. So we're taking this in, looking at it from what I described. I want us to think about what time of day this could be. Yeah, there's definitely, it's that first or last light, you know, that is just touching the mountaintop. And we're almost at this vantage point where we're peering out to the mountains. Maybe, you know, and again, just done a hike, or, you know, we're getting ready to take on the day, or we're relaxing after a long hike. And so it's this sort of, for me, you know, dawn is what could be, dusk is appreciating what has been. So it's a really contemplative work. And if you all have traveled or spent time in the Blue Ridge Mountains, hopefully it sparked some memory of that experience, because this is in the Blue Ridge of Virginia. It's very different for the artist in terms of subject matter. George H. Ben Johnson was a self-taught artist, and there's a picture of him on the right here from 1917. This is called Idol of Virginia Mountains. And so there's a great connection to Virginia in this work, which is probably one of the reasons the museum felt drawn to it as a representation of Virginia landscape. George H. Ben Jonson, he went to Hampton as well, so another great Hampton connection. But before there was an art department there. So again, he really taught himself and started out his career in the arts as a political cartoonist. So I want to show you an example of one of his cartoons. On the left there, he did cartoons for the Richmond Planet, which was an African-American newspaper. And they were really rooted in social justice and civil rights. And again, this is 1919. So we're talking very, very early. And you can see it here, thinking about, empowering the Black man and really making sure that they have a voice, they understand their voice has weight and power. So a lot of his cartoons speak to this. And then on the right is a work from our collection, which came into the collection in 2016. So you think about 1945 was the first work by him that entered our collection, and it took till 2016 for another work. This is from a series that he did celebrating the history of Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is something he references a lot in his cartoons as well. And these became illustrations in a history of Ethiopia, and he would later put these out into cards. And what I loved kind of taking a look at this is that there are mountains in the background, and then we have a figure in the foreground writing. This is Athiotes, who is an Ethiopian writer. So it's sort of set, says 2212 BC. So he's kind of thinking about that history. And we see Athiotes standing, writing at a table. Again, there's an arch behind him. So he's in some kind of palace or building. And then far in the background in the distance, you see these mountains. And those mountains remind me of Idol of Virginia. There's that beautiful blue, and just the top of another one is some orange. So this is a great work that can kind of combines the figural work he's doing in his cartoons along with that landscape of Idol of Virginia. So George H. Ben Jonson was really well known in Richmond, and he, with these Ethiopian works, became known all across really the eastern kind of seaboard. And so Ben was introduced to George H. Ben Jonson probably through, I'm going to say probably Mary Godfrey or his connections at the museum, because George H. Ben Jonson would come to the museum. And so he started to get to know Ben in 1940, like late 48 to 49. And around that time, Mary Godfrey was also encouraging Ben Wigfall to apply for a fellowship. So when you applied for a fellowship, you needed recommendations. So George H. Ben Jonson wrote a recommendation for Ben Wigfall. And you see Ben's picture again on the right in this next slide. And on the left is the work that he submitted as part of his fellowship application. This was actually stapled to the application. You can see the staples in the four corners. And it's a line drawing of a house in Churchill. Very detailed, very realistic. And the exciting thing about this exhibition, not only bringing all these works together, but the family of Wigfall have donated his archive to the museum, and so we've been able to digitize that archive, a lot of that archive. Still a lot more to go, but you can go on our website and you can actually see George H. Ben Jonson's letter of recommendation to Ben Wigfall. So it's a great example of, again, a practicing African-American artist really mentoring Ben or getting to know Ben, and then writing that recommendation letter. And when you have a recommendation letter in that packet from such a well-established, well-known artist and member of the community, that's going to go a long way. And he did win that fellowship that year, and then he would go on to win 2 more. All right, and that brings us to the next work we're going to take a look at. So I mentioned we've seen a work that he would have seen, we've seen a work that he would have seen, but also known the artist. And then the last work is something that would have possibly influenced him, but also by an artist that really helped change the trajectory of Ben's artistic career, but also the museum's collection. So we're looking at a work of art by a man named Stuart Davis. This is on view again now in our American galleries. And it's a big painting. It's taking up most of the screen. And the center of the painting is the word champion. It really bright colors, red lettering, and they almost look stretched out, again, abstracted a little bit. And then it's surrounded by all these other shapes. We've got yellow triangles on the left and a curlicue on the left, a blue rectangle that's coming down the side of the rectangle that champion is in, 3 blue lines coming across the word champion in a diagonal, green lines coming from the corner. So it's very colorful. It's a lot more punchy in color than we've seen in the other 2 works, and a real shift from that landscape that we saw. This was done in 1950. And if I'm using my hands a lot, I talk a lot with my hands, but this work, again, kind of like where Samela Lewis's work was really closed and introspective, this work is the complete opposite. It feels very jazzy, for lack of a better term. There's a lot of frenetic energy that's coming off of this painting. And if anyone else, again, pop in the chat if you're feeling the same way or if you have a different impression from this work. But it has just a lot of voice to it to me. And it's very engaging, but also very different than what Richmonders were used to seeing in 1950. So this work was on view as part of an exhibition called American Painting 1950 that was curated by Leslie Cheek, the director at the time, who had just kind of come to the museum pretty recently before that. And man, this painting and everything in that show caused a stir in Richmond. There was abstract art by de Kooning. There was work by Jackson Pollock. There was work by Georgia O'Keeffe. And Richmond wasn't ready. There were so many letters to the editor. It caused a scene, and Cheek loved that, getting that attention. And there was another person who was commenting, well, if this caused that much of an uproar, then it's exactly what Richmond needed. So it was really a chance for Richmond to see what was happening nationally in American art. And again, Wigfall would have been there. He would have seen it. He would have come to see the show. And Stuart Davis had been, there he is right there. So the next slide just shows a picture of the work of art on the left and Stuart Davis on the right. So you can see what he looked like. He's standing around in between a lot of frames. Another one of his work is behind him, the same kind of abstracted use of shapes. It's a black and white photo, but I'm sure that painting has a lot of color in it. And he looks very professorial. And by this time he was really seen as a forward thinker, and had been influenced by a lot of European modernists, specifically Matisse. And if you're familiar with Matisse's cutouts, which also have a lot of flat shapes and bright colors, you can kind of understand the influence on Champion. And this was produced after about a year and a half where he hadn't been painting. He was actually going through a lot of personal challenges. He was recovering from alcoholism. And so thinking about the word champion could be also sort of a commentary on how he viewed himself on the other side of those challenges. Now, champion came from a little matchbook advertisement, Matchbox advertisement for Champion spark plugs. And he took that word and again, abstracted it, made it completely different. And for Stuart Davis, he was always saying he paints the American scene. He's painting what is around him. And again, that's something that Wigfall talks a lot about. It's something that he basically really infuses the students at Communications Village to do. Look around you, art is around you, reflect your surroundings. And that is what Stuart Davis was doing. He was taking scenes around him, but then sort of abstracting them and using his own sort of visual language to communicate that American scene. So after the success, we'll call it success or notoriety of this exhibition, this work was bought from that show. So it entered the collection in 1950. And Cheek invited Stuart Davis to come back the next year to jury the Virginia Artist Show. So the same kind of show that George H. Ben Jonson was in 1945. And this time, Ben Wigfall submitted chimneys to that Virginia Artist exhibition. On the left is Benjamin Wigfall pictured with chimneys in 1951 when it was on view as part of that Virginia Artist Show. So you can see him on the left. He's got his hand up, gesturing to chimneys. And I'll talk about chimneys and what that looks like in just a minute. But I wanted to also show a picture on the right of the Marshall Street Viaduct, which crossed over from Churchill into downtown. In this picture, you can see MCV, the original MCV hospital building on the left, City Hall right behind it, and the viaduct is on the right. And just to the right of the viaduct are chimneys. And those are the chimneys that are depicted in Wigfall's painting. And Wigfall would cross the viaduct every day to go to school. And these chimneys was something that was always constant for him. In terms of the landscape. So we come back to Stuart Davis, saying he paints the American scene, what's around him. And that's what Wigfall did in this work. He painted what he saw every day. And so the work itself, again, the next slide is showing it on the left here, next to Champion, just for a comparison. And chimneys is, this painting, love this painting. And it is 3 or 4 chimneys, looks like 4, kind of on top of one another. And they are in black, mostly black. So they're very weighty, kind of the bottom half of the canvas is the structures that support the chimneys. The top half of the canvas, you can see sort of spaces in between, so sort of the vents within the chimneys. And all of that is in black and white grayscale, except one section of these vents are primary colors from left to right, blue, yellow, and red. And this is where they're sort of imbued with that shot of color that really enlivens these works, these chimneys. And the chimney in particular I'm talking about with the colored vents on the right, there's just almost at an angle, sort of like a talking hand, sort of, if you've ever wanted to do a puppet and made your hand talk. It looks like that to me. So it almost looks like it's chatting, this chimney is chatting. And that reminds me a lot of the lines in Champion, where they're just imbued with this energy. So while the rest of them seem a little somber, this one chimney is kind of the star of the show, talking a little bit more. And so it gives that kind of energy, a little bit of energy, like that is seen in Champion. Now, can we say for sure, that Ben saw Champion in 1950 and thought, oh, I like this way this energy is feeling, like, how can I incorporate that into my work? Don't know. But there's, again, the formal qualities in here have some similarities and some kind of influence. Now, I mentioned that Stuart Davis, helped change that trajectory for Ben. And it's really true because he was one of 3 jurors for that show, that Virginia Artist Show. And if you recall, I was talking about the museum would always purchase something from the Virginia Artist Show. Well, the unanimous decision for the first place purchase prize that year was for Chimneys by Ben Wigfall. So Stuart Davis was part of that decision-making process to help select Chimneys to be purchased by the museum. Came into the collection in 1951. That means it was the fourth work by an African-American artist to come into the collection. And it still holds the record for a work by the youngest artist to ever enter the collection. Ben was only 20 years old when he did this work. And we bought it from him in 1951. So I mentioned, again, these three works connected to Wigfall in some way, either that he saw, he knew, or helped change the trajectory of his career and his artistic practice. And I'll just end with a quote by Samela Lewis, who we met with our first work of art. That I think really speaks volumes. She said, "Art is not a luxury, it is a necessity." So I really appreciate you spending time with me today to explore these three necessities from our permanent collection.
Thank you so much, Celeste. That was really great.